So thank you for being here. We're here to talk about universal design for learning. I just want to spend a moment to introduce our panelists, but I first want to thank CTRL for hosting us here, specifically Anna Olson, who, as all of you know who have worked with her, is incredibly thoughtful and detail-oriented and helped us think through who should be on the panel. And so she is truly the muscles and brains behind this. So thank you for all of that. Thank you to Panera. And so my name is Marianne Thomson. I lead the Academic Support and Access Center, and that is the center that I'm sure many of you have worked with, but we do academic support for all students, disability support, and support for student athletes. We have several ASAC people here, so if you guys could stand up so that they're good people to talk to afterwards as well. So, there we go. They're clumpy, but they're great. And so we talk about universal design a lot, and so we're thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with all of you today. And then to my left is Lindsay Northup-Moore. She also works in the ASAC and is our Director of Disability Support. She's been here for about a year and has made a huge impact already in how the campus is thinking about disability support. I see Derek Cogburn, who we had the chance to go to the UN with a few months ago, and he already knows the great work that Lindsay does. So I'm glad that she's going to be able to talk to you a little bit more about disability here at AU and what the accommodation versus universal design thing looks like. We next have Angela Dadak, who is a faculty member in the College of Literature, Department of Literature in CAS. She also is the coordinator for international students in that program. So and I think a lot of you know her on campus here. Sanem is definitely nodding there as a true champion for international students and understanding how teaching needs to be more inclusive for that population. And then we're honored to have Sarah Irvine Belson from the School of Education. Her role now is the Executive Director for the Institute for Innovation and Education, and she really understands universal design for learning on a deeper theoretical, more academic level. So, and has looked at it a lot from the K-12 setting. So having that expertise on our panel, we're really lucky to have. And then finally, we drafted Kim Westmeyer. Yes, just on Monday, is that when we drafted it? Yeah. So you'll see her intelligence and flexibility on display here. But she's here in CTRL, and one of the things, she'll talk about this in detail, but we are so excited that CTRL is really stepping into the UDL space in a big way and the accessible classroom space in a big way. I think that's been a focus over the last few months, it seems like. And from the ASAC perspective, we couldn't be happier. So Kim will be able to talk about the things that as faculty members, CTRL is here to help you with. All right. So universal design, as we talk about what universal design is, and so who has a good understanding of what UDL is? Okay, show your hands. Who has really no idea, is glad that there's sandwiches and thinks that this could be interesting? Okay, great. I love honesty. So universal designs, just to give you a little bit of a background, started as an architectural framework. So how do we physically design environments? So who is in National Standards, at least been to National Stadium? Okay, so there are very few stairs in that whole stadium. It is almost all ramps. That is created in a way that it's accessible for almost everyone. It helps crowd control, it helps people pushing strollers, it helps people in wheelchairs, but it also helps people with mobility impairments that you can't see. And so that's the example of universal design where it's not hurting anyone, and in fact, it's helping a lot of people. So on campus at AU, SIS building is another amazing example of that. I'm sure our catering staff would be able to say how much they appreciate that there's no stairs going in and out of that building, and so they don't have to look for the weird spot where the ramp is. So it started as a very physical idea, this idea that instead of doing an accommodation for someone, so instead of making, because we have stairs, we have to build a ramp, why do we need the stairs in the first place? That was the idea. Okay, so now that's gone into the learning space, which is frankly where really exciting and interesting for us at the university. So things that we do that are accommodations, and Lindsay will talk more about that. So specific accommodations that we do for students with disabilities, or specific things that we need to do for international students and other populations. and said, how do we kind of blow that up and say, what's something that we think about for a specific population, but in fact, when we do it for all students, it's better and deeper learning for all of them. So that's our framework there. And so with no more overview, we'll let Sarah get into some of the more specifics of UDL.
Hey everybody, so again, thank you all for being here one way or another. We're looking forward to hearing from you. We've got some time built in for questions from you. We'd love to hear your own thoughts and expertise and experience with it. And thanks very much to Marianne for organizing us and putting us together and being so enthusiastic about our work too. So what is UDL? So Universal Design for Learning, as Marianne said, really kind of frames itself about how do we kind of conceptualize the things that we want to do. So if you want to get into that stadium, you want to watch a ball game. For learning, we have to really think long and hard about what do we mean by learning? What exactly does that mean? If we as faculty members are constantly rethinking our ideas about what is knowledge and what should we know and be able to do as researchers in our field or professionals in our field, we also conceptualize what does it mean to be a student of that field? What does it mean to conceptualize a piece of knowledge or have access to it? And so what UDL tries to do is it has for probably the last 35 years been studying this idea of what do we actually mean by learning and how do we get into this idea of learning. So the UDL framework, which is presented here in sort of 3 pieces, which I'll talk through in just a second, basically tries to think about, so what truly is learning? What are the neuropsychological or neuroscience-based structures that we know are going on in the brain? As far as we know, most of learning takes place in the brain. Fascinating, I know. That was your big takeaway from this session. But anyway, but learning isn't just rote memorization of facts, and that's what UDL tries to say. So UDL kind of frames itself along these 3 structures. So I'll talk you through this visual a little bit here. But basically, what UDL tries to say is that there are 3 components to learning. And most of us probably just think about what, that middle kind of purple area. What is it that we want students to learn, right? But in reality, in order for learning to take place, we need to engage the whole student, the whole kind of experience, the whole of our field, the whole of the contributions of not only the individual student, but the student's relation to others in the community. So basically, there's the first line, which is the affective area, or the why of learning. And the goal here is, again, to think about what is it that happens that inspires a student to learn. And so again, if you look at this matrix, underneath the why of learning, underneath the engagement piece, basically there are 3 levels down. So this ultimately becomes a 3x3 matrix for those of you kind of mathy type people. And so under each area, the why of learning, the what of learning, which I'll talk about, and the how of learning, we think about how to access learning, how to build learning, and then how to externalize learning, right? So within these, and again, I'll talk about them a little bit more on the next slide, but basically that's what these areas try to do. So the why of learning is really what engages the learner. What helps that learner really think about this is something important. So one of the first questions we asked you when you came into this room is, why are you here, right? Why do we have our students take the general education courses? Or why does the core look like it's supposed to look like? Why are we really trying to get students involved in this? And we really think about that basic limbic system part of the brain in terms of getting kids motivated and interested in our fields. We as researchers, we as faculty members are very impassioned about our fields, and we're also motivated and interested in the, kind of the main core of our field from a very wide perspective. So that's a piece of the Universal Design for Learning piece. Next is what, and again, most of us kind of think about that representational piece. What is it that students learn? Again, from the neuropsychological perspective, we're just basically talking about those basic cognitive load. How does information get in, and how does information get out? And again, across those areas, it's not just access. It's not just access to information, multimedia or those sort of things. But again, also thinking about how students make sense of this information when they talk about it, when they think about it in relation to the other things that they're studying. And then finally, the how of learning. And this is the really interesting part for I think all of us, is how do we actually teach our students to become students of our field, right? If you're studying history, I think any historian in this room, and please don't throw anything at me, doesn't think that history is the memorization of basic facts. In fact, history should be a study of how historians do their work, right? And that's what gets us excited, I think, about our disciplinary fields, is how do we actually study what it is that we want students to study. And so this idea of how of learning really gets to those strategic methods. How do we think about what I know today? How do I apply it to other fields and kind of move on from there? So that's basically the overall UDL. And again, I love UDL from the science perspective, because not only is it, thinking about, of course, the science of learning and where it happens in the brain and how it happens in social environments, but it also allows us to think about students as scientists of their own brain. Ourselves as our own scientists, thinking about, again, what our fields are, what our practices are in our fields, and how those are reflections and analysis on our practices move us forward. So the next slide, it goes a little bit deeper, and I promise I think I'm taking up too much time, so I won't blather on so much. But basically, this expands that 3x3 network, or the 3x3 framework. So again, this is all, I should have said this in the beginning, and there's a link, we're giving away these slides, to the Center for Applied Special Technology, which is a group that's been doing this research for years. There's also the UDL Center, .org, that basically has, again, research to support all of this. And again, what excites me about the framework from a person who studies learning is, again, how the research supports these different things. So just a couple of examples I wanted to share. So for example, why, right? So if we think about why should students be studying what they're studying, what the UDL folks try to think about is, what's the research that supports having students thinking about why they should learn? How does that ultimately help them become effective learners and deeper learners, if you will? And so I found a recent study just from higher ed in particular. There was a study, Molina and Casado, which is cited on the UDL website, that talked about how when students in the Catalan region in Spain worked with other immigrant students, and they created these immigrant learning societies, they actually developed a deeper understanding of others and culture, right? So use this UDL framework to think about if we can actually engage students in this idea of fostering community or collaboration in society, actually led to deeper learning across all areas of the framework. Another one that I thought was kind of interesting, and I was just sharing with my colleagues up here, I just read a study about faculty learning communities, and Kim will talk a little bit about some of the faculty learning communities that are here, but the fact is that when faculty can work together, you can kind of, again, come to a deeper understanding, just like we're doing here today. If I wasn't talking, you were talking. And just under the what, again, maximizing one of the areas of what is maximizing comprehension. So yeah, we want students not only to know what we're learning, but also maximizing how they transfer that information to other areas. So an example of research here is a study of basically spatial learning. A lot of times we think about how can we apply spatial learning, and so in this particular study, again cited on the CAST website, they talk a little bit about how we get kids to think about when they're studying language. They can think about language within space and time, and actually increase the level in which they could transfer that information across different languages. And then finally, and how I just thought I would throw out there, this study of understanding authenticity in studying behavior or business analytics. So again, I don't know how many business faculty are here, but business analytics seems to be something that is challenging for some students to develop a knowledge of. And so what they studied was how could they have authentic learning environments that help kids figure out why is it that we should study business analytics and how it actually applies in a real life environment. So again, just some of the research based behind UDL, just to kind of frame our conversation.
Thanks so much. So now we're going to hear from Angela Dadak, who's going to talk through the international student perspective of how UDL, when you put it in practice, has huge returns for our international students.
Thanks, Marianne. I'm putting your timer on, so I don't ramble on too much. I'm getting used to the microphone here. So think about international students, we think about where they're coming from, who are the international students at AU. And thanks to International Student Scholar Services, here are the statistics from last year. This year, they're still coming in. And so as you can see, we had more than 1,600 international students studying here from more than 150 countries, and the top countries being China, Germany, India. Now, this is where they're coming from. When I think of designing for international students, what are some of the characteristics of the international students I take into account when I am building my classes and I'm building individual class sessions and when I'm building my courses? And a couple of things that will come up, of course, I think language and culture, which sounds really broad. So let me break down to a couple specific characteristics within those that I apply within the classes. In terms of language, a lot of students I work with are English is an additional language for them. And one of the main considerations in terms of coursework and of topics is time. It takes time for students more time for students working across and within different languages to read, more time to write, more time to take in language, process it, develop a response, whether that's going to be in a class discussion where everyone's talking, you're thinking about, okay, what's being said, how do I respond to that, what am I going to say, or in class test, reading the prompts, reading perhaps the multiple choice ones, and going out. So time is always an issue across languages. Another thing to think about is language acquisition. We're all learning. I'm still learning words in English, and I was raised a monocultural native speaker. And no one speaks academic English as a native language. Or I haven't met anyone who does. But, so we're trying to continuum here, right? So, and if you are coming to English mainly as your language for school, and that's where you're using it, that's sort of the other end of the continuum, right? And so, in what ways can I use practices that can enhance language learning for students? An off-cited statistic within second language acquisition is that it takes about 6, 7, 8 years to acquire proficiency in an high academic level of English. And so how can I facilitate that? How can I not put roadblocks into that in the activities that I'm designing and the materials that I'm choosing? And I'll have some specifics in the next slide. But let me talk for a minute about culture. And I'm using a fairly broad idea of culture. My apologies to specialists in the field. But I mean more than snacks and holidays and traditional dress. There are two aspects when I think of culture when I'm putting my classes together is one is culture as content. What perhaps unexamined, sometimes I don't examine them until it comes up in class, assumptions am I making about students' cultural knowledge in terms of understanding and reading, in terms of understanding an assignment, of going forward on that. We have, for example, the incoming undergraduates are going to be reading a book called thank you, Strangers in Their Own Land. And a lot of that does deal with the current political, cultural divides between the right and left, conservatives and liberals, and trying to understand that. Now, if you're coming from a place where instead of right and left, the divide is from the left and the liberalists, or you're not as familiar with those things, you're going to understand this book a little differently. So how can I say, okay, not everybody has the same understanding of right and left. As a first generation college student, well, this was a long time ago, I could have used some easing into these kinds of topics and some background information to make sure I knew what I was talking about too. So how can I open up that topic? Anyways, a short example. Another one in terms of, so culture's content, what am I assuming, what cultural assumptions is in my materials or activities I'm designing that could be excluding some people. Also education culture. A lot of our classes do a lot of discussion. Our writing demands critical thinking and application, not just repetition of things. But there are education cultures, and there are students coming from cultures where showing you're smart and being a successful student means you listen and repeat, right? And so on that, if you're a student who's had most of their education culture from there, say their first reading response, it's a little funny because it's mostly summary and not going into it. That could be a reason there. The purpose of discussions, what are we discussing in class? What am I supposed to be saying? Why are we doing this? Why do I have to listen to her and not the professor? What's the point? So different kinds of cultural clashes. And sometimes, actually, what looks at like one issue turns out to be something else. In one of my first years at AU, I had a writing studies professor come to me and say, I have this Korean student. Now, she was a first semester Korean student. She had all of her previous education in Korea except a month of English in an English language exchange program in Australia. So that's where she was coming from, and it was the first month of AU. And she had gone to her professor's office hours, required office hours, to talk about her first draft, right? The professor said, everyone's coming in, we're gonna have a conference about a first draft. And the professor told me, I was really worried. I thought she was understanding things. I thought that her language level was fine. But when I asked her, what questions do you have? She couldn't respond. If she didn't understand that question, then her language level is, I don't know what to do. Now, I had met with this student, so I had very great conversations with her. What had happened really was when this student went in to meet with the professor, what were her expectations? Professor's going to tell me what to do. That's my role, is to listen and receive. And, you know, coming from, and so she didn't know that it was her job to sort of at least begin that conversation and show her knowledge by being able to analyze her own work and ask smart questions. So what looked like mainly a language problem was actually mainly a culture problem. Now, a caveat too on international students. Okay, not all international students are working English as an additional language. Not all students who are working English as an additional language are international students. You have students who have, and you have international students like the one I just described, but you also have international students like the student who came a few years later, also from Korea, had started his schooling in a British school in Spain and finished and did high school in an American school in China. He has different understandings and expectations of the classroom of knowledge. So when we're talking about international students, it's not in a box, right? They're bringing different knowledges, different levels of understandings all along the way. But these considerations can help them and can help other students as well. So I'm going to run through some. Now I'm going to go back to one. Some of the practices that help. This is not an exhaustive list, but keeping in mind these language time, language acquisition, cultural assumptions, or educational cultural practices, how do I help those sort of inform some of the things I do in class? I'm just going to touch on a couple of these, and this is not an exhaustive list. The first one I am conscious of all the time, giving multiple language inputs to anything I do. I almost never just give written directions for a class activity, verbal directions for a class activity. I want people to be able to see them as well as hear them. Now, if you're thinking about it in terms of a language acquisition standpoint, you know, due to the vagaries of the English language, what you see is not always what you hear. So there are times when I know a word with my eyes, I don't know what it sounds like, so if I only get the oral input, I'm not going to get it, right? And actually for me myself, I get distracted, I need to revisit the directions written down. So that's one way I consider that first one. I'm going to skip down to explicit practices. Making as explicit as possible the practices in my class. If we're going to do discussion, how much and why? I try for reading, what are we doing this reading for? If you think about it, everyone is from fairly accomplished scholars. When you approach a reading, you approach it differently depending on what you're going to do with it. And we don't always think about that with our students, right? So letting them know that this is for discussion, so come up with a couple questions perhaps, you know. Or we are going to pair this with the other reading on counter argument, so we analyze their use of counter argument. I'm going to do that second reading differently if I know that that's what I'm going to be doing with it. So trying to prepare it that way. Another odd example I've come up with is office hours. Relationships between student and professors vary across our university, across the world. And in some places, the professor is up there and you don't talk to them. But one of the reasons perhaps, and they're really excited about going to talk to professors, and we want professors in office hours, we want students to come to our office hours. But what do I go to? Yeah, office hours, what do I do with that? So actually on my syllabus, I have every week bullet points on what to do in office hours this week. And they range from, come to talk to me about your paper proposal that you turned in last week and your ideas on going forward, to thoughts you have about the readings of this week's discussion. So something very broad or something very specific. And that helps students know things that they can come in to talk about and have in hand to get it more regular. So my last note is at the bottom, is making these opportunities available for all students and not really targeting them. I recommend this highly. Not saying if you're an international student, you can bring your paper to me 2 weeks in advance on the work the draft. Make that available to everybody, and why not, right? And in fact, there is, reading the research, right, just a couple days ago, a Japanese student who actually was really uncomfortable bringing her work to her professor until the professor invited everybody. I have late work policies for opportunities for everybody. If students are struggling with discussion, I might say that anybody, this is why we're doing discussion, these are some parameters I have for it. If you're struggling with it, come see me. I'm not saying international students who are having trouble, come see me. Or English second language learners, come see me. I'm saying anybody can come, and then I have strategies to talk about that in class, which I can talk about later. Anyways, so these are some ideas to go forward, and I know Lindsay's gonna talk about some more of these as she goes forward.
Thank you so much. And I think something to pull out of what Angela talked about is that there isn't a box of international students, and that brought up a thought that I was supposed to bring up earlier, which is that we're talking about universal design and how it's good for all students, and then we're doing a deep dive into two populations, one of them being international students, one of them being students with disabilities. These also apply to first-generation students and other groups on campus. And so I think why universal design, at least to me, is addicting, a very healthy addiction, I'll tell you, but addicting nonetheless, is that when you make these changes, you're not hurting anybody else. So when you're saying explicitly, here's what we're going to do in office hours, it may help an international student from one culture, but not another one. It doesn't matter then. For the other person, they just say, okay, I know what office hours are. I can skip that sentence on the syllabus. It's not hurting anyone, just like ramps don't hurt any of us. And so I think as we go through this, that we can have a tendency of saying, well, because these populations are so diverse, and by saying, you can't really generalize to all international students or all students with disabilities or all first-generation students. That's fine, but whatever your entry into UDL is, that will, when you make changes thinking about that one population or that one student or that one issue, if you think about it through a UDL mindset, you will probably end up improving the learning for all of your students, or at least more of the students in your classroom. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay, who's going to give us that deep dive on students with disabilities.
Hi, everybody. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just giving you a brief overview, a very brief overview of students at AU who are registered with disabilities. We have approximately 15% of our undergraduate students are registered with the ASAC for one or more disabilities. This number is actually hot off the press, and I was really interested to see it because it's pretty high compared to other institutions. And for me, that's pretty exciting. I'm really glad that we're capturing those students. But it also means that these students are in your classrooms. If you have a classroom of 20, you probably have at least 1 or 2 students with a disability in your class. So these are all of our students. The national average is 20%. So 20% of people in the United States have a disability. It's the largest minority group, and it's also the only minority group that any one of us can become a part of at any time. So I always like to throw that out there because I think it's interesting. So we're doing a really great job since we have 15% of our students who are registered with a disability, because typically students with disabilities do not proceed to post-secondary education at the same rate as general education students. So anyway, I'll be doing a deeper dive into that in the coming months. The actual number is likely more higher as well, because not all students with disabilities are registered with our office. Some students choose not to disclose because they may not need accommodations, or they just may not think they need accommodations or want accommodations, so they don't disclose to our office. So we probably have, it's more than 15%, but that's the number that we know of right now. The top 3 disabilities at our school right now that students register for are ADHD, learning disabilities, and psychological. Psychological includes anxiety, depression, OCD, bipolar, all of those, the highest being anxiety and depression at our school. And if you notice, all of these disabilities, these are the top 3 by far, they're all invisible. The vast majority, I think it's something like 98% of all disabilities are invisible disabilities. So it's really, you need to be thoughtful, and we're not making assumptions when we're talking with students, because it's very possible that they could have a disability. So the most common accommodations for those of you who teach in the room, you probably have seen all of these, are extended time on exams, reduced distraction testing environment, and note-taking accommodations. These go closely along with the top disabilities. Students with ADHD and learning disabilities typically do receive extended time on exams and note-taking accommodations. Okay. So the next slide we have here is, it goes along with a lot of what Angela said, and everything that Angela said works for students with disabilities as well, and everybody, as Marianne said. But I wanted to bring up some examples of universal design that are helpful for students with disabilities in the classroom. It's also important to note that even though I would really like to put myself out of business, universal design isn't going to get rid of accommodations. Accommodations will always exist and need to exist, but universal design makes the environment more inclusive and more welcoming to all of our students. Think about when you guys signed up to come here, you assumed that there were going to be chairs and tables for you to sit at and eat your lunch. That was just assumed because that's what generally individuals use and do when they come to a lunch meeting. But if you use a wheelchair, you would like to assume that whatever building you're going to, you'll be able to enter, but that's not always the case. So that's a reason for how universal design is used to make, or an example, to make the classrooms more accessible, or everything more accessible and inclusive. So anyway, things that you can do in your classroom that are really helpful are provide more than one option for assessment. We all know that we all learn differently. Whether we have a disability or not, we learn differently. I'm very auditory, but a lot of people are visual or spatial. So providing this option is really, really helpful. It may only be, you may have an exam and the option to write a paper. This is really helpful for students who have disabilities. If a student has a memory issue, they may choose to write the paper rather than take the exam, because taking the exam is going to be harder for them to remember all of those facts. But for other students, it works for all students as well, because even if you don't have a disability, you have preferences on what you'd like to do. Some people really like taking exams, so they'll take that exam. Or the student might know, well, the exam is on this day and I really can't be there that day, so I'm going to write the paper. So that also takes away the negotiation that often comes into play when students need not an accommodation, but an adjustment from you because of their life activities. So that's one example. The other one is similar, but is to provide more than one option for class participation. Not everyone is really gung-ho to talk up in class. So that works for all students. We all have bad days. If you show up for class and you just I just had a fight with my mom, I can't talk, but I'm here. So providing, rather than speaking up in class, maybe you let your students also either talk in class, maybe write a one-page paper about what they read the night before, or about the discussion, or maybe you have online discussions in Blackboard, and that's the way that students can get participation. Using all three of those is a way to universally design your class. It works for students with disabilities. If you have, say you have a student who has a speech impediment, and they're really just not that comfortable or able to speak quickly up in class and answer those questions that you're asking right away, they can use the opportunity to sit, listen, figure out what they want to say, and then provide you with that information. Or if you really feel like you need it orally, maybe they can come to your office hours. and provide that to you, but they might need that little extra time. But it's not always the student with a disability who needs that. Yeah, so it also helps faculty members, I feel, are to take the negotiation out of a lot of things, adjustments that students might ask, the general population of students. If you have more than one option, then the student can plan for that and figure it out. If the student's gonna miss class, if you already have that option in your syllabus saying, you know, if you miss class, this is what you need to do to make up the assignment, the student doesn't have to come to you, they already know. And that works for students with disabilities as well. And if you think about it, we do this every day in our professional lives. Some of us prefer to speak on the phone. Some of us prefer to do things through email. Some prefer to do it through text. And we get to make those choices all the time. In the academic environment as it exists today, it's pretty rigid. So thinking a bit more about how can we, and we're trying to prepare our students for the professional world. Sometimes there's a reason that things need to be the way they are, and that's completely fine. But thinking about, is this really the only way we can assess this? Is this really the only way the student can participate? It's just something you want to think about when you're designing your class. It can be definitely extra work on the front end, but on the back end, it really allows for a more inclusive environment, and I think makes your lives a lot more easy as well. So.
Thank you. So something I want to highlight about what Lindsay said is these changes or modifications that we make to our class to make them more universally designed. I think a first gut reaction is sometimes like, why write a paper? No, I need it in an exam. And take that second step and say, why do I need it in an exam? Is recall for what I'm trying to learn in this moment really, really important? If you're teaching emergency room medicine, absolutely. Writing a paper about how to assess whether this is a gunshot wound or not may not be the most applicable thing because you need to make judgments really, really quickly and time matters. No one here is teaching emergency room medicine. So thinking through, because we don't have med school. So thinking through, when I did this kind of stuff at med school, it was harder. Thinking through, though, what am I actually trying to teach? What am I actually trying to assess? And allowing your mind to open up a little bit rather than kind of the quick reason why it won't work will really expand. And I know, because I've worked with so many of you also in the capacity in the Dean of Students office, I know that you all are, by the end of the semester, doing 1 to 2 basic independent studies for students in your classes every semester. Someone has a trauma that happens, they might have a major medical issue, a family drama that happens, and they're asking you for really significant changes to the syllabus. Can I write these papers over the summer? Can I drop one of the exams and will you count these ones double? I know I haven't been to class in a month, can I do this instead? So you're already doing this, and I know the stress that that puts on you all as faculty members. Instead, if you spend more time ahead of time thinking through, what if someone misses class? What if someone says that they missed the test and the test was really important? What would I do? If you think about that on the front end, then when the issues arise, because we all know that they will, you're able to give the same options to everyone. You've planned for it, and it feels that it's more equal. Whereas I know when we ask you to make those changes, what many of you wrestle with is this really feels unfair to my other students, and you're probably right. So thinking about it on the front end, giving the options to everyone will really help. It also allows students to keep their privacy. Flexibility in work environments is another example of universal design in the workplace, since Lindsay brought it up for us as adults. Some industries say you can either have schedule A, B, or C, and we don't need to know why. So it may be that you see your therapist at 9 a.m. and that's why you need to start work at 11. It may be that you like to walk your dog. It may be just that you really like morning TV and you don't want to miss the rest of the talk shows in the morning. I don't care. Just pick that schedule, right? And so if we can kind of open up, then it allows people to not have to divulge this incredibly personal information to you, and then you're making judgments in the classroom of, do I extend this paper because the sob story is this intense? Because that's not a place that any of us want to be if it can be avoided. And then we at least minimize the numbers of modifications that you need to make throughout the semester because you thought of it on the front end. Okay. So now Sarah's gonna wrap us up, and then we'll get into, Kim will talk through what CTRL can do.
So I'm gonna make this super fast, because I feel the eagerness of people to ask questions. So I think the only thing I would just say is, like, in my 23 years at AU, I love that we're all in this together. And so all the things that we've just said about what we do for students, hopefully we're doing for ourselves. I mean, I think when we think about the whole education, this whole making of a better human being who will have the jobs that we're sitting here loving right now, you know, we're making the next generation of great people. Maybe they're better than us. This is this opportunity for us to think about our own sense of what we bring to our field and our craft. And so I hope that this has been interesting to you in terms of that whole idea of just, again, thinking about ourselves as scientists of learning as well.
Great. So what do you do next, right? So CTRL is really happy to be a part of this. I'm really happy to be a part of this because over the summer we've been thinking really thoughtfully and hard about what we can do to help you as faculty make your courses more accessible. So CTRL is here for the how. How is this going to look in your course? What does this look like for you specifically? So we're here from the small scale to the larger scale. So your course as a whole or all the way granular. We can talk about everything. So some of the resources that we have are going to enable you, hopefully, to make small changes. These small changes can make a very big impact for your students, not just specific populations, but all of them. So we're really excited to roll out these accessibility guides. So on the table tent that you have here, so on the side here, it says accessibility guides. So we have created sets of guides that will allow you to start with your course materials. How can you make your course materials accessible for everyone? So some of the guides that we've created so far are alternative text for images, descriptive hyperlinks, headers, colors, saving documents as accessible PDFs. So these are really, really small things that we can all do that honestly don't take that long to do, and once you get in the hang of it, it's kind of like a game, finding little things that you can do to make them more accessible. So I recommend that you start there if you're overwhelmed. The other thing about the accessibility guides is that we are not going to have these be static. We are looking to continue to expand the resources that we have online for you to answer the questions that you have. So if going to the accessibility guides is not enough and you want to take it to the next level, that's great. We are available in CTRL to do one-on-one consultations with you, group discussions with departments on what this looks like in your discipline, in your field, in your course, in a specific assignment as well. So we are really, really happy to do that. And the other part of this too is something that we've been really excited about is we are now kind of leveraging our relationships that we've created with different departments to if we can't answer a question for you, then we will find the office who can work with you and who can better help you. So we're kind of the launch pad for things, you know. So if there's a question that you have that I might not be able to answer, but someone like Marianne could, then great, I will refer you to her and you can work together there. So we are really happy to be collaborating on this and to really point you in the most helpful direction that we can. And so the other part of this too is, I'm going to put in a plug for one of our campus partners, is e-learning support services. So something that I think is really amazing and I was pretty jazzed about is that now in Blackboard, Kaltura, the multimedia center, kind of the recording space that you can, now has the option built in to caption your video. And it is with a 70 to 90% accuracy rate. That's pretty good. And so I think that's a really good place to start too if you're showing videos in your online course or if you have supplemental materials and they're in Kaltura, you have the option to caption them. And again, these adding captions don't hurt anybody. It really just helps everyone. So having the material presented in multiple ways too. So I think that's it for me, and I am happy to talk with any of you. We have on our website, we now have a button where you can book me, so you can look at my schedule or anyone else's schedule in CTRL to see if we can find a time to talk. And I really look forward to working with you.
I think we have a few minutes for questions. Just to jog your memory, here's where we started. We want to make sure that you leave with what you wanted to leave with. So we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions, and then maybe we can stay up and you can ask individual ones. So, yeah.
I have a question for Sarah. Sarah,
Oh,
okay, thanks. Sarah, do you use neuroplasticity in UD as a natural mechanism for learning?
Yes, great question, and I meant to say that. So the idea about neuroplasticity, what was your name again?
It's a hard name. I'm Romanian, so it's Mircea, actually. In my first year here, I started teaching in 1970. That's a long story.
Well, it's just great to have you here, and I'm sure others could benefit from this great question, because the idea of neuroplasticity, and particularly with thinking about these different structures and functions of the brain, is that we all know that the brain changes as we learn. And especially these freshmen and sophomores that we have in front of us, and they're going through that second adolescence or second toddlerhood, we even think, in terms of the ways in which their brains are changing, or for those of us on the other end whose brains are sort of starting to fall apart. This opportunity of neuroplasticity says that other parts of the brain can actually help the other pieces, right? So if a student's particularly motivated, all of a sudden those, representational and the hows of learning make so much more sense if the why is really charged up. So I think that's absolutely right about the function and structures of the brain actually are plastic, and we know that they're not, and, especially when they're in front of us as students, they're not set in stone.
Thank you very much. I believe in neurogenesis as well. I have to.
I have a question specifically.
This is a little UDL note, is that you always want to use the microphone rather than saying like, can everybody hear me? This is just one of my things. Because most people with hearing impairments you can't actually see that they do. And so, and they probably can't hear you when you say that. So it's kind of NA. So, always just
My question is specifically about this, to make the classroom more accessible for students with disabilities and with different learning styles. So you suggest that if a student wants to choose the option to write a paper rather than to take an exam. And my question is this, across the board through all of our classes, we do a combination of both. And is it really a benefit to the student to always avoid their weak suit? Do they not really learn we also want to challenge our students to develop new skills. And it seems to me if we agree, we'll just let a student do what he or she is better at, we never really embrace the alternative. And that alternative may not exist in other classes, for example. So we're not doing them any favor by letting them duck the more difficult options.
So yeah, a few thoughts, Sarah. Great question. Thank you for raising it. I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And also to recognize, as Lindsay brought up, we do this as adults all the time. I am highly extroverted. I would be a terrible researcher who's like in a corner doing my own thing and only checking in once a month. So we as adults know how we learn best and we gravitate towards those things. Yes, we expose ourselves to things that we're not that great at, but we minimize it. And so part of it is, can you have a discussion in the class about why someone might pick a test versus a paper, and what does that tell them about themselves? And do they, and the exact discussion that you just had, I ask you to try something new. If you tend to do this, expose yourself to the other thing, that sort of thing. So having that adult conversation with them could be really interesting. Another way to do it would be, over this class, I want you need to take 3 assessments. You can do papers or tests. One of them needs to be a paper and one of them needs to be a test, but the second one, I don't care what you do, or this percentage for this and this percentage for that, and give them some flexibility and choice there. So I think it's both the recognizing how we, and this is a bit of what Lindsay was talking about, we as adults create a lot of flexibility in our lives that we don't afford to our students because of the rigid ways that we create environments. So first of all, are we forcing them to do stuff that we don't do? And then how can you incorporate both so that you can expose them to things so they can learn more about themselves? Because maybe they think, we know this about a lot of students with math, I'm terrible at math. And then you actually take the math class and you're like, I like this stuff. And so exposure actually is quite important. But how can you minimize their risk so they do some appropriate risk taking academically? Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much. I'm Derek Cockburn from SIS and COGAT and the Institute on Disability and Public Policy. So thank you all for this very much. So one question about the different types of assignments, the multiple means of representation. Is there a danger that you can see of giving students too many options? So is your recommendation that maybe you say, as you just said, a paper or a test? Or, you know, I think sometimes I've felt like students have been somewhat paralyzed by having too many options. And I like to give them lots and lots of options. You know, getting ready to start class in a few weeks here for a capstone seminar where I try to give the students a lot of flexibility, but sometimes that flexibility overwhelms them. And I'm wondering if I'm doing them a disservice by giving them so much flexibility. Is the recommendation that here's 2 or 3 options, choose one of those, or do you think it's a good idea to keep this level of flexibility?
I think that makes sense for some, like to give 2 or 3 options. I think also all of this is very course specific. So you're going to teach a really different class to first year students than you are to capstone students who really know themselves by then. I think you could also say, here's 2 things, and if you can think of something else where you can show this learning, that's a great thing to talk to me in office hours about. So to kind of put that onus on them. I think that, again, that piece that I brought in of when students have drama throughout the semester and they're asking for things, it puts the onus on them of saying, okay, and when I work with students and the DO students, I would say, you've got to suggest something to the faculty. You can't just say, I missed class for a month, what should I do? You have to say, I missed class for a month, I thought about it, here are the things that I think I can do to show the learning. That's my first proposal to the faculty, and then you start to negotiate. So I think putting that adult responsibility on the student to say, these 2 things don't work for you, give me something else to chew on.
And something my immediate reaction to your question was what you've been saying, that going back to what do I want them to learn? What is the point of this? What am I assessing? What are some different ways to show that? And then, you know, I like to give a couple choices in the, okay, propose something, here are what you need to be showing me, how can you show that to me? But also, if you have a range of options, if you're like, okay, no, it's not only 2 or 3, I really do have these 5, guiding them through the choice. And so I think it's saying, okay, here are some ways to help you decide between these options would also be helpful.
And then adding, if you do need to follow up on this, come talk to me in office hours. This is a good thing to come talk to me about.
It's a good thing, yeah.
Thank you. If you can let me tell you out loud what I've been thinking, and then based on your knowledge of UDL, tell me if I'm on the right track or not. There are things I want my students to do in class, like write or solve a problem. And those require time. And so you mentioned time is something that we need to think about. And also thinking about students with learning disabilities and a need for extended time. In the past, what I would do is keep time constant, meaning this must be done in 20 minutes, but be flexible as to how I interpreted what was produced in those 20 minutes. But that means I'm not giving extended time to students with accommodations. Can you talk to me how I can embed things in class that I think need a time-defined limit, because the class bell, so to say, is going to ring after a certain time, but yet offer the flexibility that UDL is designed for?
Why don't you start? So pop quizzes and that kind of thing are really, really hard for students with disabilities. It sounds like from what Angela said, international students as well. And I think just being very honest, you have to be an amazing grader to not treat them differently when someone can write 3 pages of really deep stuff in 20 minutes and someone else is still idea forming and writing 3 bullet points. So I think that would just be really hard to assess, actually, even if you're kind of going to try. So instead I would say, what is the point of that in-class assessment? Is it to check that they understood the reading? Could that be something that you could send out 2 hours in advance, and they are more than 2 hours in advance, 24 hours in advance, and say, you need to write in on Blackboard something about this. If it's kind of check their reading. If it's instead to just give a break during the class. I teach a 2-hour evening class at GW, and you gotta give a break of like different ways of learning because they're dying at 7 o'clock at night. So I would do some in-class reflective times that I didn't necessarily even need to grade, but it would be spend 5 minutes, write down some stuff about what you're thinking about, what's a question you still have, so it provides a reflection time, and then time isn't as important. But graded assignments when you're providing time are very, very difficult on the accommodation front because the student is entitled to the extended time, even if the faculty member says, no, but I won't account for it in the same way. The student should have the option to represent themselves in an equitable way.
And then thinking of it, I didn't even go to assessment first. I went into this as a class activity. And you have 20 minutes to work in this group on this problem. And, ideally you'd like them to finish. So, and so I'm thinking of the purpose of it is not so, so I like what you're saying is sort of you do have to cut it off, but you're flexible sort of on what comes in and where it goes for. So I think I'm thinking like, lots of things came to mind. One of them is I knew when I have that designed, I'll have students get as far as you can, or sometimes if I designed, it's like a couple series of things to talk about. The questions towards the end are if you get to this point, right? So, or I'll tell them at least do this far, and then if you still have time, get into these ideas, right? So I kind of do we need to get through this much. Sometimes if it's something like, okay, you do need to finish, I do need to see where you go to on this. I'll say, okay, we're going to start this in class. We're going to talk about how far you got to, and then finish up maybe post on Blackboard after class if some people do finish. So I have that flexibility sometimes, right? Things like before discussion, having a prompt and having students rewrite about that a little bit, and some students will write the full, some will have bullet points, some will have 2 sentences. And that's fine because it's going to depend on, that's simulating for talk. It's good for students who need more time to put their thoughts together. It's good for shy people. It's good for the loquacious people who just go on and on and on and on and on, but then they can plan what they're doing. I'm going on and on off topic. So I like the way that I think it makes sense. I mean, we don't have the time coming out, but letting students know what the time is, how far they need to get, probably being flexible on like where we're going to discuss from there, and if they need to finish it, where the follow-up is. If it is something that they're supposed to finish in a certain amount of time, diagnosing a gunshot handing in a journalism piece. I do writing, and there aren't that many times in real life where we can't go back and revise and take time with writing. But if you have that deadline for the paper, that's one place where time is going to be important. So thinking about how much. Sorry, so I'm getting back to where time is a factor in the actual thing you're trying to accomplish. Does that give you some insights on what you're doing? Yeah.
I think something else to think about too is this a low stakes assignment or is this a high stakes assignment, right? So if it is a high stakes assignment and it's worth a lot of points and it is time constrained, that adds another layer of pressure for a lot of students. So if the student doesn't finish the assignment, then what does that mean? Does it mean that they are totally lost for the rest of the class? Or does it mean that maybe they just need to pay attention a little bit more to other people?
I'm sorry, we all wanted to respond to this, Amara. Thank you for the question. I think the one thing we talked about when we were preparing for the panel is the difference between accommodations and modifications. And the point is that accommodations are things that make the same learning criteria, same learning standards accessible for all students, versus a modification that actually changes your ultimate outcome, right? And so my concern about the second thing that you said, that it's choosing an assessment process that says, well, I keep the student in mind in terms of what they're capable of, makes me concerned that you might have a different standard for that student. And that's why I think, maybe you don't, but I think that would make me concerned if you were saying, well, I know the student is X, and so my, standard for them is lower. And so that would be just a concern if that was part of the process.
So let me just clarify. We've been talking so much at CTRL in the past year about the use of exit tickets at the higher education level, where I imagine a faculty member 5 to 10 minutes before class can say, write down what you've learned in this class today or a question you have for me.
Yeah.
That's a defined time. The class is going to end 10 minutes after you give the exit ticket.
Yeah.
Right? So there's no time to extend the time by which a student can be writing an exit ticket.
Yeah.
And therefore, when the professor reads those exit tickets, you're not penalizing someone for writing 1 or 2 sentences in a bullet form or even not complete sentences, nor do you privilege someone who writes it in a full paragraph, right? And so does that meet the expectations of universal design, or am I violating the principles? So not tests, not high stakes assessments, but things that happen in class that have a defined time limit, how can we give those to everyone without identifying, okay, you get the exit ticket an hour early, but you're gonna get it 5 minutes before the class ends?
So you're always gonna do better UDL when you provide choice. Like if you provide, one word from this is choice. So if you can say with that exit ticket idea, you know, write down some questions that you have for me as you're leaving class for not 5 minutes. But also, if you think of something as you're walking home or as you're reading, email it to me. So then you give the person both choices, and they don't have, because some of our best ideas happen in the shower, on the walk to work, or something like this. So give them that option, because they will, and it also teaches them better adulting, that, you know, your knee-jerk question may not actually be your best answer. It might be the one that comes in 24 hours. And so that choice piece, anytime with UDL, you can say, like, here's one option. That's a good option. What's another option I could give for this? And not have to have people tell you why they need it.
Yeah, and perhaps also framing it too at the beginning of the class so that they can start to chew on these ideas while they're in class, so that when they actually do get to this 5-minute space, they've already started thinking about this. And especially if this is a practice that you've done constantly, then they're already in that mindset of, what do I need to be thinking about for the end of the class too?
This last one? Or no? Last question. Okay, last question.
This comment about modification as opposed to accommodation raises a question in my mind, as dealing especially with international students, because I've always tried to make what you would call a modification in terms of the allowance for my demand otherwise that people use proper good English, and say that if English is your second language, I will make an allowance for that. But I've always said the allowance is not a 100% allowance. All right? In other words, because I don't want people to take it for granted and say, well, he knows English is my second language, so I don't really have to try. So,
yeah, I think Angela wants to respond, so I'll jump in really quickly. You know, I think it depends on the assessment. I mean, if it's a class where proper English matters, then, you know, you should probably have less flexibility. If the assessment really isn't about the student's level of English, then I think you have some room there. Again, I think it goes back to Amara's question. What's the point of the exit ticket? What's the point of the assessment? If the point of the assessment is to have the students demonstrate some knowledge of the discipline, then perhaps the flexibility in terms of the exact language, you know, use of formal language and colons versus semicolons matters. Or it doesn't matter. If it matters, it's a specific English or thing. Again, with Amara's question about exit tickets, she wants the students who walk out of the door of a room to tell her what they learned that day. And if, you know, 24 hours later, they want to say, hey, Amara, one of the other things I learned in your class was this, that still gets to the information she wanted from that assessment. So I think, to me, I think the point is to go back and look at the modifications and adaptations you're making that actually change what you were hoping the students were getting from the activity.
So Sarah says that very well, and so let me just wholeheartedly agree with what she was saying. I'm also going to quote John Hyman, who was the former head of the writing program here, and saying, you know, we sort of worry about assessing the writing of all students differently, or assessing the writing of international students differently than we do of other students or second language writers, multilingual writers. I was like, we assess everyone's writing differently, right? Everyone who comes into our class and you're looking at that paper, there really isn't quite a single standard. I mean, students are coming with the different ideas and the different abilities to organize and write. So there's always some consideration of that difference. Another thing, it's the aim. So for example, I had a colleague come to me and say, oh, can I have this Japanese student work with you because she can't get any of her prepositions or articles right, articles being a, and the. And so I talked with a faculty member for a while about how those are very difficult to, they almost seem arbitrary in English. Even linguists can't explain every single usage. But so if she wanted her student to perfect that why, is this because they're going to submit it to a journal where they're going to be dinged for it? Is it affecting the meaning of the writing that she's doing? And so asking the professor sort of to think about that standard of correctness, and then understanding, the opportunities. If the professor really did want every article and preposition correct, then that's gonna, the advice would be to have someone read for that student. It's not a question of proofreading in yourself and you'll get it. So maybe understanding more of what you're asking, what the aims are. There's actually some really fascinating conversations right now going on in the world of English as an international language or English as a lingua franca in terms of scholarly publication, stuff coming out of Romania, I think even, especially talking about the, what do we do when scholars are publishing in English and we get a manuscript that looks like X? How much do we sleep or not? How much do we leave? There's an accent and we get it, but is it correct and what is correct? There's fascinating debates going on at sort of that level among many journal editor publishers, not all. So yeah, it's a tricky question, but it comes down really to what Sarah said, I think, the most.
So I love that this has been such a good discussion. We could probably take 10 more questions. So please come up and ask any that you have. And I hope that we've converted a few of you to UDL addicts. So thank you for spending the time with us.